sections. The first will be the early days in Europe. The second section will be about moving to America. And the last section will cover our church way out west where we live. There will be a few breaks for questions and comments. If you do choose to comment, which is fine, wonderful, please keep your comments short because time is limited. And I would just add that this is basically a lecture with a few breaks in between. And I apologize for the lecture, but I didn't know how to do it otherwise. So let's get started. It all began in 1708 in a very small town in Germany named Schwarzenau. 8 persons were baptized in the Eder River. Alexander Mack was the leader. He was baptized first, and then he baptized the other 7. By the way, if you want to be sophisticated about Brethren history, there were 4 things in that brief paragraph you will need to remember. They are the year the movement started, 1708, the name of the town, Schwarzenau, how many were baptized, 8, and the leader's name, Alexander Mack. If you don't remember anything else I say for the rest of our time together, you must remember those facts to be in the know. I need to stop here and back up. These 8 baptisms were a very significant step and were part of a movement in Europe that had been going on for over 200 years. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to the door of his church. He was not interested in leaving the Catholic Church, but wanted to make its practices more relevant to the lives of the people. He believed in the idea of the priesthood of all believers. The church leaders in Rome were unbending, and the Lutheran movement began out of frustration. 19 years later, in 1536, Menno Simons, a Catholic monk from the Netherlands, formed a church now called the Mennonite Church. His concern also was the lack of relevance of the Catholic practices to the lives of the individual. Another movement was a reforming of the Lutheran position. It was more rigid than the Lutheran. These members would tolerate only practices found in the Bible. The group was called the Reformed Church in Germany. To English speakers, it is the Presbyterian Church. So, in 1708, in Germany, there were 3 churches that were recognized by the state. The 3 churches were the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Reformed Church, or the Presbyterians, if you would prefer. All 3 practiced infant baptism, and the state required all persons to be baptized as infants into one of the 3 churches. It was a crime punishable by death to be baptized for the second time. This brings us to the first important Brethren belief, called believer's baptism. These early brethren were serious students of the Bible. They met and discussed what they understood the Bible to be saying before they took a position. They could find no biblical justification for infant baptism. John the Baptist was baptized as a grown man. Jesus was baptized as a grown man. They thought the act of baptism should be the result of a deliberate decision on the part of an adult not an automatic thing done to an infant. They called the idea believer's baptism. So even though the state considered second baptisms to be treasonous and punishable by law, the 8, and then in time, many others were rebaptized as adults. Now, I should mention that the early brethren did not, and we do not, think if you are baptized, you are saved. They saw it as a statement or symbol of commitment, much like we do today. But in our history, there were many issues around baptism. Often the specifics of the mechanics became so important that the real meaning of the act got lost. Today, in the Church of the Brethren, we let people join our community even if they've only been sprinkled as an infant, if they personally feel they are baptized into the church. The denomination got its name from the fear of the state's punishment for being rebaptized. They did not give their community a name and did not do so for years. They referred to each other as brothers or brethren. The area around Schwarzenau was reasonably tolerant toward dissenters. Mennonites had lived in the area for several years and had been basically left alone. The Mennonites were quiet about their beliefs and differences and did not rock the boat, so to speak. The Brethren were not so quiet. They held revival-type meetings in an open space in Schwarzenau. In fact, they held so many meetings there, it is called the Anabaptist Yard even today. Truth is, they were zealots. Their main targets, if you will, were the Mennonites. They converted many Mennonites to their movement because they were more fired up than the quiet Mennonites. Because the Brethren were so fired up and caused such a ruckus, they drew the attention of the authorities. What really caught the attention of the authorities was when they started proselytizing members of the 3 state churches. Some brethren were arrested and put in jail. Some were actually killed for their beliefs and evangelical practices. The brethren moved to other areas in Germany that were more tolerant, and some moved to Holland and eventually even to England. We've spent some time now talking about the early church's beliefs about baptism, but they had other important beliefs, and I will share 4 of them with you now. Pietism. Pietism was the name of a progressive concept during the Reformation that talked about an individual's personal relationship with God. Simply put, the individual should read the Bible for themselves, pray about what they understood it to say, and follow that. It's a very simple explanation of a complicated belief. Anabaptists. Anabaptists were people who felt that it was important to discuss with others what they understood the Bible to say. In other words, they should test their thoughts with a group of believers. It also has an element of evangelism in it. There is a responsibility to share the word with others. The early brethren knew about both of these movements and made them a part of their practice. Peace. Our message of peace came from the early brethren taking not to kill in the 10 Commandments to heart. The Mennonites also believed killing was against God's word. Another imposing factor was the 30 Years' War that had ended a few years before. It was still very much in the minds of the brethren. Many men they knew were forced to fight, and many died in the war. This war, at least in part, was between small kingdoms. It mattered little to the little guy who won, because all of the kings taxed the people and did little for them while forcing them to fight. The brethren had lost much in the war, felt it was very wrong, and was against God's commitment to kill. Their feelings about the horribleness of that war contributed to their commitment to taking the stance for peace that they took. The last of the four beliefs is no force in religion. Another idea they stressed was no force in religion. This, of course, had to do with the state requiring all persons to be members of one of the three state churches that we have talked about already. So a question. So what do you think about these four beliefs? Do we follow them today? Have our ideas about them changed? Do we still practice them? What do you want to say about them? We'll talk about them as you like to. If you have comments you want to make, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Could you go over pietism again?
Sure. Again, very briefly, pietism is the study of the Bible and understanding it for yourself by yourself. And that is an enormously simple explanation. A Bible scholar would probably laugh in my face, but that's basically what it means. I can give you a little idea of the idea of pietism and Anabaptists that is a little bit crude, but it kind of helps you see, I think, what they're like. You think about it in terms of how you dress. And a pietist is like being in your house in your underwear. You're not going to go out. You're going to do something in private. It is for you, and you stay in the house. The Anabaptist gets dressed and goes out and meets the community and greets the community and works with the community and talks with the other believers about what they believe. Is that helpful at all?
Thank you very much. That clears up a lot that I've wondered about for years.
I'm not going to say very much because I've only been involved in a Brethren church for 6.5 years. I do want to note one positive area of service of the peace side of things is that I understand that some brethren have become chaplains in the U.S. military. Maybe I should say, medics. They brought healing in the midst of battle. The other thing I wanted to do was to share a book that Russ Madison gave me when he did my Brethren installment. It's called Fruit of the Vine, A History of the Brethren, 1708 to 1995. So if you really want to dig in, this book could help you after tonight's outstanding presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I very much appreciate what you're saying too. It's extremely well done, but I did want to point out, like Phil just did, that our books and there was a large survey of brethren in 2008, the 300 years, and among other things, it showed that although we're a peace church and annual conference has multiple times taken a stand against war, that in fact. Most of the brethren are okay with war, and indeed in all the major conflicts, particularly World War II, about 90% of the brethren men went to war, and the 10% were COs.
How are we doing on time, Annalee?
You've got, it's 6:53, so you still have almost an hour.
Thank you,
We're
Al.
not
We
talking
just
about
chatted about having about 5 minutes for feedback. So I'm just keeping track of how long we have, and we have about 3 minutes.
Anything else, or should we move on? Well, let's move on. Have you heard of the band? This was a practice developed a little later on to keep members in line. If a member did not follow the decisions of annual meeting, all other members, including their spouses, was to ignore them. So, for example, if a man cut off his beard, he was visited by the elders, and if he said he was not sorry he cut it off and planned to be clean shaven, then all members, including his wife, was told not to talk to him. The purpose behind the ban was not to punish, but to persuade the individual to return to the fold. The ban is still practiced in some of the more conservative Brethren denominations today. As a part of this study, I share the names of 3 early leaders and a little about what they did. As a part of this, I have already mentioned Alexander Mack. Alexander Mack was the leader of the group and first member of the movement. He was baptized as an adult in the Reformed Church. His family was wealthy. His father owned a mill that he passed on to his 2 sons. After Alexander became involved in the movement, he sold his half to his brother and used his wealth to assist others in the movement. He, with a group of 40 families, moved his family from Germany to the Netherlands in 1720 and then to Philadelphia in 1729. Peter Becker, as tradition has it, Peter Becker was a very large man, refused military service in an elite branch of the German army, and was tortured for refusing. He said he already had a captain, Prince Emmanuel. He moved his family to Pennsylvania in 1719. John Knox was a great preacher and minister in Europe as well as in America. He brought the last groups in America in 1733. My grandfather, Matthias Gish, 8 times back, was on the last boat from Europe with Knox. We now move to our second section, in America. William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania and was a leader in the Society of Friends. His vision was to create in quotes, a holy experiment where religious freedom and opportunity could triumph. Our early leaders definitely knew about Pennsylvania and its religious freedom and cheap land. It was a long, costly process to get here, but with the help of Max and others' money and the promise of a better life, they boarded boats and came. The first baptisms in 1708 in Germany, and by the year 1733, only 25 years later, all brethren were in America. They spoke mostly German and were now in America, which was dominated by English-speaking people. Most brethren settled in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Some went inland into what is described as the wilderness. The first congregation was formed in 1723. Becker was the minister. Many Mennonites and the related Amish were converted by the brethren as they were attracted by similar views of the church and practices and the greater fervor of the brethren. Things went relatively smoothly for the Brethren in the New World. But then things got tougher for everyone as the American Revolutionary War began in 1775. In many ways, the war was more of a civil war than an anti-colony war. It was American versus American. Families, communities, whole areas were torn apart by differing allegiances. The population in America was pretty equally divided into thirds. There were those favoring the revolution, about a third who supported the British, and there were those who were trying to be neutral. The Brethren tried to be neutral, but when pushed, the Brethren came down on the side of the king. Here are 3 reasons for their siding with England. There were actually several more, but I'll just share with you 3 for tonight. Number 1, the Brethren's attitude toward the state was to accept the powers that be. It was not at all clear to the Brethren that the revolutionary government was legitimate. The Continental Congress was very weak. The 13 states controlled the money, and the government had a very hard time raising enough money to fight the war. The Brethren believed that God established kings, and it was not clear to them that God had abandoned the state. Calvinists saw it a different way. The king was a tyrant, and a minor magistrate had the duty to overthrow him and bring in a new government. Congregational and Presbyterian preachers were leaders in the revolution. Number 2, and this is a very important point, the Brethren appreciated the freedom and opportunity granted by the king after their experience in Germany. That one really fits. Number 3, the British Army, if they wanted a cow, paid for it in silver coin. Rebel soldiers took what they wanted, and if they paid anything, it was in nearly worthless paper money. Many Anabaptists migrated to Canada. Some migrated after the war was over because they were unable to shift their allegiance to the new governments. Question: what is your reaction to the Brethren position during the revolution? How do you feel about that?
Well, it's,
I can, oh, sorry, go ahead, Al.
no, go ahead, Phil.
No, I'm saying I can understand their position, and I can even understand it during the Confederation that ultimately led to chaos that resulted in the Constitutional Convention. I like to think that those who remained recognized the existing power of the United States of America by the time George Washington was elected president, but I don't know. I'm not going to comment on the Revolutionary War period. Those were interesting reasons, but I guess I'm coming from a very strong position for those who fought and died to establish a country that had freedom, that allowed brethren to be pacifists.
Well, of course, that didn't happen, Phil, until we got the Bill of Rights, but nevertheless, it existed in Pennsylvania. Actually, Felton, I agree with Phil. I agree with you that your argument was very strong. But one thing I did want to ask, and maybe it's tangential, you didn't mention Alexander Mack Jr., and I thought he was the big shot in the America once they got here, or something like that.
Yeah, I picked and chose, Al.
Felton, this is Ken. It seems like I remember that Christopher Sauer, who was a printer, operated a printing machine, and he differed with Benjamin Franklin, who also printed a lot of literature in their attitude towards the revolution and whether they supported the colonies or supported England. And there was a lot of difference between them because I guess because Christopher Sauer didn't feel it was important to break away from England. Is that the case? I heard that about him.
Ken, you're absolutely right. That was a part that I cut out of this to make it short enough to do it tonight.
Okay.
I had to make a lot of tough decisions. And Christopher Sauer was actually, well, I think he was actually beaten for his position. And his presses were taken away from him, I understand. But he actually did support some of the things that the rebels were supporting. But you're absolutely right. He was on the bad side of the rebels, and he got in trouble for it.
Okay.
All right, Felton, that's been about 5 minutes.
It's been 5 minutes. All right, well, let's move on. After the Revolutionary War ended, some brethren began to move out of Pennsylvania and the Germantown area. Many brethren were farmers, and they went seeking good farmland. A few moved west, and others moved south to Virginia, and a few even farther south. After 1800, small schisms began to appear as the brethren became more acculturated and were influenced by other more progressive Protestant groups, such as the Baptists and the Methodists. As time went by, tensions over the differences increased. Here is a description of some of the issues causing contention. Regulated garb or dress. Many annual conferences during the 19th century regulated dress. Up to this point, simple but less regulated was the standard. Donald Dernbaugh, in his book, Meet the Brethren, cites two thoughts about garb regulations. Some think brethren were influenced by plain dress of the Quakers. Others believe the garb was an archaic form of German costumes. And evidently, nobody knows for sure. Some members wanted to dress the way they wanted to and even follow the fashion of the day. The more conservative view would be to not make looks important. Belief in God was what was important. In addition, a peculiar dress could build community, and the brethren leaned heavily on the idea of a strong community. Another conflict area, raised platforms. Raised platforms separated the speaker or leader from the rest of the members. Brethren believed in the sight of God, all people were of equal importance. But the more progressives took a practical approach, pointing out that the raised platforms would improve the congregation's ability to see and hear. Higher education can create societal thoughts and uppityness instead of finding truth in the Bible. Sunday schools were unnecessary and wrong. The family should teach their children about God and Christ in the scriptures. But by 1850, Sunday schools began to appear in some congregations. In 1857, annual meeting ruled that Sunday schools were permissible if conducted in gospel order. Protracted revival meetings were wrong because they created pressure and emotion to make a decision to join the church. As you recall, the brethren felt baptism and joining the church should be a meaningful and carefully thought out decision by an adult. Set apart ministry. Instead of everyone being equal, the hired minister easily could become the authority. But for some, better education and more knowledge is good. Question, what's your thoughts on these beliefs?
Well, since I'm in higher education, I'll comment on that one. I think yeah, well, I think it's really interesting.
Al, are you gonna support it or go against it?
Well, the thing is it obviously came to a head in the 80s, in the 1880s, and the brethren who were generally suspicious of too much education until then suddenly started creating all these colleges. And I think there were 7 or 8 that were created, and 6 of them have survived. So it's just an interesting flip-flop, perhaps, or maybe it's one group finally won out. I don't know.
As a Reformed Baptist Congregationalist, I will note that the Congregationalist insistence on higher learning for pastors greatly inhibited their ability to spread across the country. And the Baptists and the Methodists moved across, though they did start developing their own schools. But there's just not that many outside of the Northeast. I mean, they merged and stuff, but sometimes it is possible to have too much education as far as going west and growing up with the country, to quote Greeley.
An interesting position. Yeah, hadn't thought of it that way. I don't know that they did either. Any other questions or comments?
One question I'd like to ask, when you were talking about the things they were arguing about, did they actually argue at any point discuss the language of service? Because Germans prevailed for quite some time, and then English must have come along somewhere. Did that become a talking point?
Maybe somebody here would know the answer to that better. I have not bumped into anything personally that was a big issue. There were issues, but it was pretty minor compared to the other things. And but by the Civil War, which we're coming to very rapidly, there were some English-speaking people, quite a few, in fact, but there were still some spoke German only. Does anybody that's listening in know anything more about that than this? Because as far as I know, it was not a terribly big issue.
I've heard the term Pennsylvania Dutch used as a language rather than German. Now, is that different from German, or why did that term get used to describe the language they used?
Isn't Pennsylvania Dutch a mix between English and German?
Yeah.
Does anybody know?
The word is corrupted. That is to say, it's Pennsylvania Deutsch,
Yeah.
and Deutsch is too foreign. So
Yeah.
Pennsylvania Dutch is what they started talking. No one, although they came from Holland,
Yeah.
I think they retained their German language.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Oh, Bev, if you could unmute, then we can hear you.
We're waiting for somebody.
I'll just confirm, having lived in Germany for 5 years before I was brethren, about an hour and a half from Schwarzenau, along the Rhine, that Dutch, D-U-D-E-U-S-T-C-H, sounds like Dutch. So I'm not sure whether Pennsylvania Dutch means Pennsylvania Norwegian, Pennsylvania Netherlands, or Pennsylvania German, but the Netherlands version of Dutch, Deutsch. A lot of that language is similar.
Thank you.
A related question is, how long did the brethren reside in the Netherlands? And I'm impressed that I believe the German language and German culture as their culture was the predominant among the brethren. And that was one of the reasons that they wanted to leave Holland, is because they wanted to maintain their brethren and Germanness.
Well, they couldn't have been there very long, because from the time they left Germany to to America was only just a very, very few years. So their time in Netherlands was very short, really. They were more like visitors, 9 or 10 years, I would guess, maybe 15, some of them.
Perhaps
Another-
Bev could share his thoughts, and then we might need to move on. It's been 5 minutes.
What I understand or have heard is that in the colonies, the division between German-speaking people and English-speaking people was almost 50-50. And it was a big deal when which language is going to become the official language of this new country called the United States.
Yeah.
And English won just barely. Very close vote in Congress. I guess it was in Congress. But even up to World War I, American soldiers spoke German. When they went to Germany, the Germans couldn't figure out where all these German-speaking soldiers came from with their funny flat helmets. But they were all northern Pennsylvania, Dakotas area, German-speaking Americans. And the argument between Sowers and Benjamin Franklin, who's going to dominate the printing business in English or German? And it was a very, very close match.
For goodness sake.
It didn't really become solid English until World War I.
My grandmother and grandfather spoke German. They also spoke English. When they wanted the kids not to understand what they were saying, they spoke in German.
Yeah.
My mother broke the code.
Good. We're ready to move on. We'll move on to the Civil War. This time, the American Civil War challenged the Brethren as they continued to refuse military service. Both the North and the South allowed for payments to be made to excuse service, and the Brethren used these plans and considered them tax. The issue that caused the Civil War was slavery. The Brethren as a group had no problems with this issue, as they did not permit any member to have a slave. If a slaveholder wanted to join the church, they had to free all of their slaves and pay them for the work they had done while with them. Other Protestant groups, such as the Baptists and the Methodists, had slaveholding members in the South, and the slavery issue caused these denominations to divide basically at the Mason-Dixon line. The Brethren stayed together throughout the war. Excuse me for a minute. Good evening. You were talking about the American Civil War. And since I lived during that time, I thought I might share a few thoughts with you. By the way, my name is John Klein. I am an elder and a minister of the German Baptist Brethren Church, and I have served as moderator of the denomination for the last 16 years, including all of the war years. I live in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I'm a farmer and a physician. I'm best known for my long trips on my horse, Nell. You've probably heard about Nell. We've gone way out west together as far as Indiana to preach to members and to doctor the sick in the wilderness. The war has been very hard on all of us. I have been imprisoned by the South as they have thought me to be a spy, as I have crossed back and forth from the South to the North and back again many times doing God's work. I have treated wounded soldiers from both sides. We brethren feel all people are God's people, no matter which side they are on, and we do not go to war, as we were told in the 10 Commandments not to kill. Although I live in Virginia, I have no slaves, as we feel all people in God's eyes should be free to live their own lives. Well, I'll not take more of your time. I hope you're getting a good feeling about how brethren have taken their understanding of God's message very seriously. The Civil War and slavery had not separated the brethren as it had other Protestant denominations. But the issues I talked about earlier caused a great deal of conflict. The issues had to do with change. Because of the conflict, by early 1880s, there were 3 distinct groups in the church. The old order group did not want to see change. The progressives wanted the church to join the modern era. And the third, and by far the largest group, called the conservatives, which was in the middle and working very hard to keep the church together. Question: which group do you think the Church of the Brethren was in, or would have been in, if it would have been a Church of the Brethren then? Would it have been old order, the progressives, or the conservatives?
The conservatives.
Anybody disagreeing with Al? Well, he gets an A. They were the conservatives, so you're right. External forces, such as the war between the states, did not split the church. It was basically one church from 1708 until 1881. Granted, there was much dissension after 1850. The difference between the two great and what external forces did not do, only a few years later, internal forces did. Welcome to the splits. I used the Brethren Encyclopedia as my main source and wrote most of this material in 1980. By then, 100 years after the original splits, there had been 36 different denominations with at least 2 congregations. That is a lot of splitting. 36 different groups in 100 years. There have been many splits since 1980, and I'm not even going to talk about them tonight. I have made a chart to hopefully make these splits easier to understand as I talk about the splits with you. The chart is going to come up here in a second. The chart is made up of 3 parts. The tan part at the top of the chart shows the 3 main groups after the splits in the 1880s. The white section is about the 2 relatively large splits that happened after that. And the blue is the 3 small denominations that followed an even more fundamental path than the original old order group. In 1980, These were the 8 largest denominations of brethren. So let's go back and start up again at the top. The Old Order in 1881, the Old Order, the most conservative group, left the church it could no longer control. The Brethren movement had been called the German Baptist Brethren. The Old Order group took the name Old German Baptist Brethren. It followed the old ways, believed in the infallibility of the Bible, and oppressed any innovations since 1850. The Old German Baptist Brethren were the most fundamental denomination at the time of the splits in the 1880s. When it split, it had about 5,000 members. And by the 1980s, when I did my earlier study, that number had stayed about the same. And I'm just going to guess that it hasn't changed much even now. The progressive movement, the next one down. The leader of the Brethren Church and the progressive movement was Henry R. Hilsinger. This group was interested in developing the modern programs such as Sunday schools, raised platforms, etc., that other Protestant denominations were doing and trying. By 1883, Hilsinger had organized the Brethren Church, the most progressive of the groups, with around 6,000 members. There are strong suggestions that Hilsinger was not an easy person to like. If he had been, the progressives and the conservatives probably could have worked issues out and stayed together. But Hilsinger was a thorn in the side of the bulk of the church leaders for many years, and they undoubtedly were glad to see him go. The Brethren Church had about 6,000 members in the 1880s, and by 1980, it had over 15,000. And then there were the conservatives, the large middle group. The conservatives had tried to keep the church together. Again, this is the group we would have been in. This group continued with the name German Baptist Brethren. 60,000 strong, it still contained many who were leaning towards ways of the old order and those leaning ways of the progressives. This group actually became more progressive than the Brethren Church by 1900. I'll repeat that. This group became more progressive than the Progressive Brethren Church by 1900. 8 years later, 1908, at the 2000th anniversary of the movement, the conservatives changed their name from the German Baptist Brethren to the Church of the Brethren. So we've been called the Church of the Brethren since 1908. Now we'll move on to the white area of the chart. The Dunkard Brethren split off of the Church of the Brethren in 19 were more conservative. Some of the members in the Modesto area today wear similar garb to that of the old order. In 1980, there were about 1,000 members. And then the next one down, the Grace Brethren Church. The Progressive Church had a split when the Grace Brethren Church split off from the Brethren Church in 1939 because the Brethren Church was considered too liberal. The main issue was the infallibility of the Bible. By 1980, it was the second largest denomination with 42,000 members. It is the only Brethren denomination that supports the military. The blue area shows 3 denominations splitting off of the old German Baptist Brethren. These 3 groups appear to be similar to the Amish, as all 3 of them were more fundamental than the old German Baptist Brethren itself. And they all left mainly, not completely, but mainly because they would not accept automobiles or allow electricity and phones in their homes. The smallest of these 3 denominations had 45 members in 3 congregations. Keep in mind, these denominations were the largest denominations in 1980. Give you time for questions or comments at this point. Anything you want to add to the, or talk about in terms of the chart?
This is very personal to me. My grandmother was born in 1880, and she, as an adult, the Waynesboro Church of the Brethren was not progressive enough for her, and she went to a country church. This is very interesting, and I'll have to mull it all over, and I have taken careful notes. I've never understood this because the Church of the Brethren in Waynesboro was very progressive with pipe organ and pulpits and so forth. And she, as a more liberal person, I was told, went to the country church with just one room and a square single room. So I don't want to take everybody's time with my personal situation, but this is I'm going to have to study on this.
I want to point out the fact that even today I hear people who are members of the Church of the Brethren refer to us as the Brethren Church, not remembering that we are actually 2 separate denominations with different hierarchies. The Brethren Church is their headquarters is in Anderson, Indiana, and they have their own colleges. They have their own officers and so forth. And so when we refer to ourselves, we who are Church of the Brethren refer to ourselves as the Brethren Church. We confuse people because we are not the Brethren Church.
That's true. Absolutely all of what you said. And in my area, I live in Modesto. Stanislaus County has Churches of the Brethren and no the Brethren churches. All of them are in San Joaquin County. There's a river that separates us. Any other questions or comments about this? It's we talk about our church being a peace church, and our movement was peace, based on peace, and yet we have so many splits. I do think the splits were because people really looked at the Bible and really took things seriously, but there are so many that it does make you begin to wonder just how peaceful we really are.
Yeah, and even the churches of the brethren in our denomination, in our district, have continually split into smaller groups. Where would you put the new covenant brethren from 2021? Where would you put them in this chart if you were going to redo it?
Well, they would have to be getting close to the Old Order Baptist Brethren Church. They wouldn't have the clothes, but some of them do. I know Jim Myers wears, in the annual conference, he wears a different set of clothes than I would wear. And so they come very close, but that's the problem with these denominations. There's little tiny things that separate them. And,
I'm wondering if they would fit more into the Grace Brethren Church, because there's the sense that the denomination at the national level in some other areas is too liberal, but that's just my view.
Yeah. Well, I see very few of these denominations merging. The trend is to split, not to merge. I don't hear any of them getting together. If they ever have, I've never heard of one. Anything else on this? Anna Lee, can we have our pretty pictures back? Thank you. Now we come to section number 3, the West. For this section, I leaned heavily on Gladys Esther Moore's book, Settlement of the Brethren on the Pacific Slope. And some of you have shared books that are valuable to our history. I would suggest that any of you that are interested in the history of what's going on the Western Slope, you might want to look at her book. It's much more than just California. It also covers Washington and Oregon, and I think Idaho. I think it's a very valuable book if you're interested in the West. Very few people were in California in 1849. Very few people, excuse me. Very few brethren were in California in 1849 for the gold rush. They were farmers, they were settlers, family people, not miners. But by 1850 or soon thereafter, after the rush had passed, brethren did show up in the San Joaquin Valley. Where do you think the first church in California started?
McFarland,
Where?
McFarland,
Macaulay?
McFarland.
Reedley,
McFarland.
Reedley.
It'd be interesting why you guessed that. The answer is no, but it's interesting that you did. Anybody else have a guess?
Reedley.
Reedley was the first.
The reason
No.
why I said McFarland was that it was the first one to file incorporation papers with California.
Okay, all right, well, okay. Why don't I tell you the answer and we'll move on. The first church of the denomination, that the movement that was started in California was in Watsonville. Well, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. I need to bring into our conversation Elder George Wolfe III, a minister from the wilds of Illinois and a leader among the far Western Brethren. He and his family arrived in San Francisco in 1856. His religious views was considered by the Eastern Brethren as not entirely orthodox. He also loved the violin, an instrument which was especially taboo. He did not consider himself heretical in any sense of the word. He wielded great influence among the brethren for more than a decade after his arrival. The first church in California was formed in 1858 during a meeting held in a grove on the Pajaro River near Watsonville, where Wolfe had settled. Wolfe later described the event in quotes, "Kind friends and neighbors who were anxious to see a church established in the lands of gold, revolvers, and Bowie knives helped the brethren clear ground and arrange for the meeting." After a very brief time, Wolfe's group picked up and joined another group near where Lathrop is today. It is not clear why they moved. Wolfe established the second church in California at Lathrop and called it the Church of California. Other brethren moved west. One group moved to the Napa Valley. At first, all went well, but as Easterners arrived, trouble started brewing as the Easterners began having trouble accepting the customs and traditions of the California church. A couple of the differences, according to Elder Wolfe, were: one, feet washing, the double mode Eastern, and the single mode Western. And I'll briefly explain those differences to you. Maybe all of you know what they are, but I doubt it. The double mode was probably like what Jesus did during the Last Supper. He probably washed the feet of all 12 disciples. So one person washed 12. In the East, what they're talking about, the Eastern Brethren, they would wash one person would wash 3, 4, 5, 6 feet to recognize that they were washing like Jesus did. That was called the double mode because they did more than one. In the West, they did the single mode, and that's what we do. We wash one person's feet. That person then takes over and washes the next person's feet. So it's called the single mode. And that in those days was a big issue. And I would guess that in some situations it might prove to be a big issue even today. I don't know. The other item that was an issue for Elder Wolf that I'll mention today is uniformity in dress. He said, we were not in oneness. The garb was not that important to them. Well, the garb was, I would think, kind of hard to get. And somebody in Pennsylvania probably had stores that they could buy items that so they could dress better. In California, they didn't have those kind of stores. So, but nevertheless, when the Easterners came out, they thought that the Westerners should be dressed more in garb, and they were just dressed with any old pair of Levi's they could find. Anyway, that's two of the items that was an issue even in those days. We have now arrived in Southern California. J.S. Flory, a Virginian, migrated to Colorado and took a trip west in 1883. He wrote articles about his trip for the Gospel Messenger, and he described Los Angeles as a thriving city of 25,000 souls. Isn't that amazing? Los Angeles, 25,000 souls in 1883. He described the land around Los Angeles. The climate is one of superior excellence and adapted to all kinds of grain and fruits, including oranges, lemons, limes, prunes, plums, apricots, peaches, etc. The soil is number one and easily worked. The whole tract is under cultivation for a farmer to go to work on it with no other expense than the cost of the land. The tract he mentioned was 2,000 acres near the present city of Covina. The Church of Southern California was organized at La Covina or Covina in 1885. The church was formed with 18 members of the conservative element. In 4 years, the membership had grown to 152. Get this, 27 of those increases were by baptism, 107 were increased by immigration. Railroads were a really important part of the Brethren migration to California. The Santa Fe Railroad heavily promoted its route, and by 1887, there were 25 towns between the eastern city limits of Los Angeles and the western edge of San Bernardino County, a distance of 30 miles. 25 towns and 30 miles. And if you think about it, we had Brethren churches in quite a few of those 25 towns at one time. The Santa Fe Railroad had an interesting promotion. They loaded an entire railroad car with Southern California produce and displayed it at the annual meeting in Warrensburg, Missouri in May of 1890. Growth was slower than they expected. The church was dealing with the differences of belief, misconduct of individual members, and concern over the breaking of disciplines. The progressive movement had taken its toll. At this point, we're talking about the Church of the Brethren. And there was great concern if the Brethren, get this, wore a mustache, a watch, or a modern hat. Also, worldly amusements were not permitted. such as Christmas trees, church socials, oyster suppers, surprise parties, and chivalries. In March 1891, the Lordsburg Hotel and 100 lots were sold to 4 brethren. Why? Why did 4 brethren buy those?
Because it was a discount.
What?
It was a discount, and after the boom crashed in 1888, they bought it for. I mean, it was a $75,000 hotel. They bought all that stuff for $7,500. So,
But who did they buy it for? What did they want with it?
they bought it to start a college.
What one?
What one?
Yeah, which one?
Well, it was called Lordsburg
Lordsburg College.
College, Lordsburg Academy, which became the college that you graduated from, Laverne College.
Laverne College, University of Laverne, that's right. So in 1889, I think on the marquee of the college, it says 1891. And the Lordsburg Hotel, and they bought 100 town lots at the same time. The way the Lordsburg Hotel and Land Company described the brethren is this: we are glad they are coming. The Dunkers comprise one of the strangest religious sects in the country. They dwell in colonies in almost every state of the Union. Their chief characteristic is humility, and to show that they perform the washing, in order to show that, they perform the washing of one another's feet at their love feasts. They wear the plainest garments and avoid any worldly folly, such as the Quakers or Shakers. Growth continued. Lordsburg Church, 1890, and Tropico Church, 1891, spun off of the Covina Church. Other churches included Glendale, Arizona in 1892, Glendora, 1902, Pasadena, 1905, Phoenix First, 1921, and Camp Laverne, 1924. Southern California became by far the largest Brethren settlement in the West. But we're going to go back to Northern California for a minute. In 1905, a new church was formed in Empire. After World War I, a hiving process created 2 new churches near Empire. They were Waterford in 1918 and Modesto in 1922. This established the second largest Brethren settlement in California. I want to mention one more leader of our church. Dan West was a modern day leader. He was a camp leader when camps were new to the church. He was not a minister. He was a high school teacher and principal. He served as National Youth Director for 8 years. In 1937, while serving in the Spanish Civil War and later as a non-combatant in World War I, he saw the pain and suffering of war, especially among children and families. These experiences led him to create many important service projects. Some of the programs he created and put into practice are Heifer Project, now called Heifer International. This is the idea. A heifer you can milk is given to a family. That cow's firstborn heifer is given to another family. The gift is passed on. He also developed the concept of Brethren Volunteer Service that President Kennedy used in his example to develop the Peace Corps. He and others created Church World Service, a nationwide organization that collected food and clothes and sent them to the needy of the world, and they still do. Dan West, in my opinion, is the epitome of the modern Church of the Brethren with its trend toward service. In closing, many ways the Church of the Brethren today has the same beliefs as the early Brethren. In other ways, we can hardly understand why the issues were so important. Dress, for example, is no longer an issue for us. We still do have issues, and splits still are continuing. The conservative group in our denomination left us last fall. The old order groups have seen many splits in the last several years. In almost all cases where there were disagreements over practices, the major reason for the disagreements were because members had very strong convictions as to how to follow Jesus. Our society needs our counterculture approach and our caring and service to others. The Brethren movement, in my opinion, has been a blessing to our society. We have romped through 300 years of Brethren history. What do you have to say about it?
I'd say I'm proud to be Brethren.
I'll say I'm humbled.
I think we have a real message. Lauren?
I'd say I'm humbled to be a Brethren.
I'm glad that when people ask me, what is the Church of the Brethren? I've been giving pretty good answers, and it's good to hear a 75 presentation. Simply, peacefully together, continuing the work of Jesus. That rings very true and is helpful in explaining who we are.
I think it's interesting that after 300 years and all these splits, that all the separate parts of the movement that was started in 1708 still retain some of the original principles and practices through all this time, for all the differences they have and all the inability to come back together. There's still, if you will, a brethrenness in all these little offshoots.
Yep. Yep.
But you did a wonderful job. I'm so glad I asked, you volunteered and I asked. So he did a tremendous job in 45 minutes to tell that whole story. And you did it in a way that was both interesting and clear. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I enjoy it. I enjoy doing it.
Very, very good. Thank you, Felton.
Thank you.
All right, well, if there are no other comments, thank you all so much for coming to this evening's session. Thank you so much, Felton. And hopefully we all get to be together very soon in a few days as we gather for business and worship.
I thank Richard as well and
Yes.
everybody for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.